Year of Dionysius Cave Prison. In 413 BC, the ancient Greek city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily won a terrible war. Athens had sent a massive army across the sea to conquer Syracuse, but the attack failed. The Syracusan army crushed the invaders and captured around 7,000 Athenian soldiers alive. The people of Syracuse needed a place to lock up all these prisoners. They chose the caves. Beneath the hills of Syracuse, there were huge caves carved out of the limestone rock. These caves were old stone quarries dug out over many years to build the city's temples and walls. The biggest of these caves was a giant hollow carved deep into the cliff face. It was 23 meters high, 65 meters deep, and shaped like a giant teardrop. The prisoners were thrown into these caves by the thousands. There was no food waiting for them. There was no clean water. There was almost no light. The ancient historian Thucydides wrote about what happened to those men inside the caves. They were packed together so tightly that they could barely move. The sun burned down through the open top during the day. At night, the cold autumn air froze them where they lay. The dead were piled up alongside the living. Disease spread fast in the filth and the darkness. Many of the 7,000 prisoners died inside those caves within weeks. Over 100 years later, a tyrant named Dionysius I took control of Syracuse. He ruled with cruelty and fear. Dionysius turned the great cave into his own personal prison. He locked up political enemies, poets, and anyone who spoke against him. But Dionysius had a secret. The shape of the cave acted like a giant ear. Any sound made inside was amplified and carried upward through the narrow top of the cave. Even a whisper at the bottom could be heard clearly at the top. Dionysius used this to spy on his prisoners. He would sit at a hidden point above the cave and listen to every word they said. He heard their plans, their secrets, and their complaints. Anyone caught plotting against him was tortured or killed. Centuries later, the famous Italian painter Caravaggio visited the cave in 1608. He noticed the shape looked exactly like a human ear. He named it the Ear of Dionysius, and the name stuck forever. The cave still stands today in the Neapolis Archaeological Park of Syracuse. Tourists can walk inside and clap their hands to hear the echo bounce off the ancient walls. But 2,000 years ago, those walls heard only screams. Mangapwani slave caves, hidden prison, on the coast of Zanzibar, hidden behind thick tropical forest and crumbling coral cliffs. There are two caves that hold one of the darkest secrets of the East African slave trade. The caves are called Mangapwani, and for decades they were used as secret underground prisons, where captured men, women, and children were held before being shipped across the Indian Ocean. The first cave is a natural formation, a large coral cavern carved by nature into the coastal rock over thousands of years. For centuries, it had been nothing more than a shelter used by local fishermen. But during the height of the East African slave trade in the 1800s, the cave was turned into a holding pit for enslaved people. Traders would march captives from the interior of Africa to the coast in chains, sometimes walking for weeks through the bush. When they reached Mangapwani, the captives were forced down into the dark coral cave and held there, shackled together for days or even weeks. The cave was damp, airless, and pitch black. The only light came from the narrow opening at the surface. Dozens of people were crammed into the small space with no food, no clean water, and no room to lie down. When the slave ships arrived under cover of darkness, the captives were dragged from the cave to the shoreline and loaded onto boats. Many of them never saw their homeland again. Then, in 1873, the Sultan of Zanzibar officially banned the slave trade under heavy pressure from the British government. But the ban did not stop the trafficking. It only drove it underground. A short walk from the natural cave, slave traders carved a second chamber directly into the rock. This man-made cave was narrow, rectangular, and completely windowless, designed specifically to hide enslaved people from British naval patrols. It was a purpose-built secret prison, invisible from the surface and impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, captives were held in total darkness, while traders waited for the right moment to move them to the coast. The artificial cave was so well hidden that British authorities struggled to locate it for years, even though they knew illegal trafficking was still happening on the island. The slave trade through Zanzibar was massive. An estimated 50,000 enslaved people passed through the island's markets every single year at its peak. Newgate Mine Underground Prison. On a cold day in 1773, the colony of Connecticut made a decision that would create one of the most terrifying prisons in American history. They took an abandoned copper mine buried deep inside a mountain in the town of Simsbury and turned it into the country's first official state prison. The mine had been dug into the rock beginning in 1707, creating a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and vertical shafts plunging 70 feet below the surface. When the copper ran out, the government saw something else in those dark tunnels, like a place no prisoner could ever escape from. They named it Newgate Prison. The first prisoner arrived in 1773, then a burglar named John Hinson, who was sentenced to hard labor deep inside the mountain. To enter the prison, inmates were forced to climb down a narrow ladder through a 25-foot vertical shaft into total darkness. At the bottom, the tunnel stretched out in every direction, cold, wet, and pitch black. Wooden platforms were built along the cave walls where prisoners slept on beds of rotting straw. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, and the temperature underground stayed near freezing year-round. The walls dripped with moisture, and pools of standing water sat in the lowest sections of the tunnels. Every morning at 4 o'clock, guards hauled the prisoners up from the caves in chains and forced them to work in a nail factory until late afternoon. Then they were sent back down into the darkness for the night. When the American Revolution broke out, Newgate took on an even darker purpose. The prison began holding loyalists, alongside convicted thieves and murderers. These political prisoners were treated no differently than the worst criminals. They were whipped for disobedience, starved on half-edible food, and shackled in the freezing caves for months at a time. Some historians believe the brutal treatment of loyalists at Newgate was one of the reasons the British treated American prisoners so harshly aboard their infamous prison ships in New York. Despite being called escape-proof, prisoners tried to break out again and again. In 1776, a group of inmates smuggled hay into the tunnels and tried to burn down the wooden door that sealed the exit shaft. But the damp underground air turned the fire into a smolder, and the smoke killed one prisoner before the plan failed. In 1781, prisoners armed with rocks and scraps of metal rushed the shaft entrance and overwhelmed 2 guards during a gate change. Several men made it to the surface and escaped into the surrounding forest. After each escape attempt, the guards tightened security, adding stone walls, armed soldiers, and eventually a 12-foot perimeter wall around the entire site. But the conditions underground never improved. Prisoners continued to suffer from disease, frostbite, and madness, brought on by months of living in total darkness beneath the earth. Buda Castle Labyrinth, cave prison. Beneath the streets of Budapest, Hungary, there is a maze of caves that most people never see. These caves sit 16 meters under the Buda Castle district, one of the oldest parts of the city. They stretch for over 1,200 meters through the rock beneath the castle walls. The caves were not built by humans. They were carved naturally by hot thermal waters that flowed through the limestone over hundreds of thousands of years. Prehistoric humans used these caves as shelters over 350,000 years ago. Stone tools from that era were found deep inside the tunnels. Over the centuries, the caves were used for many things: wine cellars, storage rooms, and hiding places during wars. But the caves also held a much darker purpose. They were used as a prison, and their most famous prisoner was one of the most feared men in history. His name was Vlad Tepes. The world knows him better as Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration for Count Dracula. In the 1400s, Vlad was the ruler of Wallachia, a region that is now part of Romania. His job was to protect Christian Europe from the invading Ottoman Turks. He was an ally of King Matthias of Hungary. But Vlad made secret deals with the Turks behind the king's back. When King Matthias found out, he was furious. Around 1462, the king had Vlad captured and dragged to Budapest. Vlad was thrown into the deepest, darkest chamber beneath the castle. The cave was cold, damp, and pitch black. Water dripped from the ceiling. The walls were slimy with mold. There was no sunlight, no warmth, and no way out. Nobody knows exactly how long Vlad was kept in those caves. Some historians say he was locked underground for over 10 years. Others say it was shorter. What is known is that when Vlad was finally released, he was a changed man. After his years in the dark, he became infamous for his extreme cruelty. He earned the name the Impaler because he tortured and killed thousands of people by driving wooden stakes through their bodies. Many believe that the years of darkness and suffering inside the caves drove him to madness. The cave that held Vlad still exists today. Tourists can walk through the tunnels and visit a chamber marked as Dracula's cell. A coffin glows in blue light at the end of the passage. Some legends say Vlad was buried inside the Labyrinth after his death. In the 1800s, people reported seeing a ghost called the Black Count wandering the tunnels at night. During World War II, the caves were used as a bomb shelter and a military hospital. Then in 2011, something strange happened. Armed police suddenly raided the labyrinth without warning. They evacuated everyone inside and locked the doors. No official reason was ever given for the raid. The caves were eventually reopened, but with a new operator and heavy restrictions. Nobody knows what the police found down there. The Buda Castle Labyrinth has kept secrets for 500,000 years. Nullarbor Plain Cave entrance collapse. In 1988, an Australian cave explorer named Andrew White led a team of 15 divers into one of the longest underwater cave systems in the world. The caves were hidden beneath the Nullarbor Plain in southern Australia, a vast, flat, treeless landscape stretching for hundreds of miles. Beneath the surface, the limestone rock held enormous water-filled tunnels that had been carved out over millions of years. White and his team had been exploring the system for over a month, mapping passages that no human had ever seen before. On the last day of the expedition, they were hauling their equipment out of the cave when disaster struck. A freak storm hit the Nullarbor Plain without warning, dumping torrential rain onto the normally bone-dry desert. The water flooded into the cave entrance with terrifying speed. Then the middle section of the cave collapsed. Tons of rock and earth came crashing down, blocking the only way in or out of the system. 15 people were now trapped underground with no exit. White and one other team member were caught in the middle section on a small rock ledge between the collapse and the rising water. Boulders were rolling through the floodwater around them, and the ceiling above was crumbling. They had two choices: stay on the ledge and be crushed between the falling ceiling and the rising water, or try to find a way through the chaos. They chose to move, climbing desperately through the collapsing rock while water surged around their legs. By some miracle, they found a gap in the rubble and managed to reach a rope that had been lowered down from the surface by people who had seen the collapse from above. They were hauled out, battered and soaked, but alive. But the other 13 team members were still trapped much deeper in the cave, in a larger chamber beyond the collapse zone. The boulders had completely choked the passageway that connected them to the exit. For the next 2 days, a desperate operation unfolded above and below ground. Surface teams scrambled to find a new way down into the cave, exploring every crack and hole in the limestone for an alternative entrance. Meanwhile, the trapped divers worked from below, searching for any passage that might lead them around the blockage. Inch by inch, the two groups worked toward each other through the shattered rock. They met in the middle and laid a guideline through the new route. One by one, all 13 trapped team members were brought to the surface alive. Valhalla Pit Cave Rockfall Crushing. On June 10, 1984, two young students from the Georgia Institute of Technology drove to the remote hills of Jackson County, Alabama, to explore one of the most impressive caves in the American South. The cave was called Valhalla, and its entrance was a massive open pit that dropped 227 feet straight down through solid rock into an enormous underground chamber. The two students were Sam Crawford and Michael Hainebaum, and they were experienced enough to rappel down the long rope into the darkness below. Valhalla was a legendary cave among American cavers. Its entrance pit was one of the deepest free-fall drops in the southeastern United States. At the bottom, the chamber opened into a cathedral-sized room with towering walls that disappeared into shadow far above. The floor was covered in a massive pile of boulders and broken rock that had fallen from the walls and ceiling over thousands of years. This kind of rock pile is called a tailless slope, and it is one of the most common features at the bottom of deep cave pits. What most cavers do not think about is that the process that built that pile is still happening. Rocks are still falling. On that summer day, Sam and Michael reached the bottom of the pit safely and began exploring the chamber. At some point, another member of their group began climbing the rope back up toward the surface. When a caver climbs a rope in a vertical pit, their movements can dislodge loose stones from the walls, sending debris raining down on anyone below. To protect themselves from falling stones, Sam and Michael moved to a sheltered spot at the base of a rock wall near the edge of the chamber. They believed they were safe under the overhang of a massive boulder that jutted out from the cave wall above them. Then, without any warning, the boulder they were sheltering beneath broke free from the wall. The rock was enormous. Witnesses later described it as being the size of a school bus. It peeled away from the cave wall in silence and dropped straight down onto the two students below. Sam Crawford and Michael Hanabaum were crushed instantly. There was no time to run, no time to scream, and no time to react in any way. The rock that was supposed to protect them became the thing that killed them. Their companions at the top of the pit heard the sickening crash echo up from the bottom of the shaft. When rescuers eventually reached the floor of the cave, they found the two young men buried beneath the massive boulder. There was nothing anyone could do. The weight of the rock was far too great to move, and both students had died on impact. Lechuguilla Cave Rockfall Burial. On March 31st, 1991, a 40-year-old expert caver named Emily Davis Mobley was 2 miles deep inside the longest and deepest cave in the United States. The cave was Lechuguilla, hidden in a remote wilderness area of Carlsbad Caverns National Park in southeastern New Mexico. Lechuguilla stretched for over 54 miles of mapped passages and plunged 1,565 feet below the desert surface. A tangled labyrinth of enormous chambers, razor-sharp formations, and terrifying vertical drops. It was closed to the public and only accessible to a handful of highly trained cave explorers approved by the National Park Service. Emily was one of those elite cavers. She had been exploring caves since 1969 and had over 2 decades of experience underground. She was part of a 5-person mapping expedition, documenting new passages in one of the most spectacular cave systems on Earth. On that March morning, about 1,000 feet below the surface, Emily was climbing a steep slope when she reached up and grabbed a large boulder to pull herself higher. The boulder, weighing between 80 and 100 pounds, broke free from the wall without warning. Emily fell 12 feet down the slope, and the massive rock followed her down and slammed directly into her left leg just below the knee. The impact shattered her tibia and left her pinned to the ground in excruciating pain, 2 miles from the cave entrance and nearly 1,000 feet underground. Her teammates rushed to her side and splinted her leg as best they could with the limited supplies they had, but getting Emily out of Lechuguilla was going to be one of the most difficult cave rescues ever attempted in America. The path to the surface involved narrow crawlways, boulder fields with gaping holes, and vertical cliff faces that would need to be scaled with ropes and pulleys. One section alone, a 40-foot wide chasm called Freakout Traverse with a 100-foot drop below, would require Emily to be suspended on a rope and pulled across while strapped to a stretcher. Another section was a 250-foot slope called the Great White Way that took rescuers an entire day just to haul her up. Word of the accident spread through the caving community, and within hours, expert cave rescuers from across the United States began converging on Carlsbad. More than 200 people would eventually be involved in the operation. Over 100 experienced cavers underground, and another 100 support workers on the surface. Many of the underground rescuers had 10 to 20 years of caving experience, and they needed every bit of it. Emily refused to be treated like a helpless victim. Even with a shattered leg, she dragged herself through the easier sections of the cave, using her arms and her one good leg. When she could not move on her own, the rescue teams carried her on a specially rigged stretcher through passages that were barely wide enough for one person. At one point, rescuers used a system of ropes and pulleys to slide Emily across the Freakout Traverse, a 100-foot drop yawning below her as she hung in the darkness. Despite the pain and the fear, Emily kept her spirits high throughout the entire ordeal. She joked with her rescuers, gave them advice on technique, and at one point even asked them to deliver pizza underground. The rescue took 4 full days, 91 hours from the moment the rock hit her leg to the moment she emerged from the cave entrance. When her stretcher finally poked up through the opening of Lechuguilla just after 1 o'clock in the morning, Emily looked up at the sky and sang out, "Bueno, Fonteno Cave Broken Leg Rescue." On December 14th, 2024, a 32-year-old Italian caver named Ottavia Piana entered a deep cave system near the town of Bueno Fonteno in northern Italy. The cave sat beneath the mountains near Lake Iseo, northeast of the city of Bergamo. Ottavia was an experienced speleologist, a scientist who studies caves, She was not there as a tourist. She was mapping an uncharted branch of the cave that no one had ever explored before. Deep underground, in a part of the cave that had no name, Ottavia lost her footing. She fell 5 meters down a rocky drop. The impact fractured her leg, cracked several ribs, and broke bones in her face. She could not stand. She could not crawl. She was stranded in a dark, wet cave where the temperature sat at just 8 degrees Celsius. Her companions climbed back to the surface and called for help. The Italian Alpine Rescue Service launched a massive rescue operation. Around 100 specialist rescuers were sent to the cave. But getting Ottavia out was going to be a nightmare. The cave was a maze of narrow tunnels and tight passages, some barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. One section was a 100-meter bottleneck, so narrow that a stretcher could not fit. The rescue teams had to use drills, hammers, and even small explosives to widen the rock so the stretcher could pass. Only 20 rescuers were allowed inside the cave at any time because the tunnels were so small. Medics set up a heated base camp deep inside the cave to keep Ottavia alive. They gave her oxygen, medicine, and warm air while the team slowly cleared the route ahead. Hour after hour, day after day, the rescuers chipped away at the rock and inched the stretcher forward. 75 hours after her fall, Ottavia Piana was finally carried out of the cave entrance in the early morning darkness. She was rushed to hospital with multiple fractures, but she was alive. But here's the part of the story that shocked Italy. This was not the first time Ottavia had been rescued from this exact same cave. Just 17 months earlier, in July 2023, she had fallen in another part of the Bueno Fonteno cave system. That rescue took 40 hours and involved a similar army of rescuers. After being rescued twice from the same cave, some people in Italy called her reckless. But the head of the rescue team defended her. He said Ottavia had the right equipment, the right training, and the right knowledge to be in that cave. Caves are unpredictable, he said. Even the best explorers can fall. Ottavia herself said she had no regrets. She was exploring the unknown, and that is what cavers do. McBride's Cave Broken Leg Flood Rescue. In 1997, a veteran caver named Gerald Mani entered McBride's Cave in the hills of northern Alabama with a small group of friends. Gerald had over 30 years of caving experience. He was one of the original explorers of this cave and knew it better than almost anyone. McBride's Cave was a wet cave, a long system of pits, tunnels, and underground streams that flowed through the mountain. The plan was simple. Enter through the upper entrance, travel through the cave, and exit through the lower entrance. But when the group entered the cave, the weather above ground changed fast. A flash flood hit the mountains and sent a wall of water crashing down through the cave system. Within minutes, the normally calm underground streams turned into raging rivers. The water rose so fast that some passages were nearly sealed to the ceiling. At the 8th drop in the cave, a 23-foot pit, the floodwater was pouring down like a waterfall. Gerald grabbed what he thought was the main rope to descend the pit. But in the chaos of the rushing water, he grabbed only one of the 2 ropes he needed. He lost his grip and fell. The fall smashed his thigh bone and his femur like a toothpick. Gerald crashed onto a narrow ledge partway down the pit, screaming in pain, with freezing floodwater hammering down on him from above. A few members of the group managed to fight through the flooded lower passages and escape to the surface. The rest stayed with Gerald in the dark, holding him on the ledge as the water kept rising. Rescue teams were called, but they could not enter the cave. The water levels were too dangerous. For hours, the teams sat at the entrance and waited for the flood to go down. Inside the cave, Gerald lay in freezing water for over 12 hours. His body temperature was dropping fast. When the water finally dropped low enough, the rescue teams entered the cave. They waded through chest-deep water in total darkness, knowing that another surge could drown them all. They reached Gerald on the ledge, barely conscious and shaking from the cold. Getting him out was brutal. Every movement had to be made through flooded tunnels with water still inches from the ceiling. 18 hours after his fall, Gerald Mani was finally pulled to the surface, alive. Doctors treated him for hypothermia and a badly broken leg. He missed 2 months of work. Then he went back to caving. Gerald said that 30 years underground had taught him one rule. The cave always wins when the water comes. Ogof, Ffynnon to Broken Leg Rescue. On November 6, 2021, a 38-year-old caver named George Linnane from Bristol entered one of the deepest caves in Britain. The cave was called Ogof Ffynnon, meaning the Cave of the Black Spring. It sat beneath the Brecon Beacons Mountains in South Wales. The cave system was over 50 kilometers long and plunged nearly 300 meters below the surface. George was an experienced caver. He had explored this cave many times before, but on this day, he put his foot in the wrong place. He slipped and fell 15 meters down a rocky slope. The fall shattered his leg. It also broke his jaw and his sternum, the bone in the center of his chest. He had spinal injuries as well. George could not move, and he was lying deep inside the mountain, surrounded by darkness and freezing water. His companions raised the alarm, and the South and Mid-Wales Cave Rescue Team arrived within hours. But when the first rescuers reached George, they realized how bad the situation was. He was over a mile underground in a part of the cave full of narrow tunnels, steep climbs, underground rivers, and waterfalls. A stretcher could not fit through the shortest exit. The only way out was through the main streamway, a long, brutal route full of water and boulders. The rescue team called for backup. Over the next 54 hours, nearly 300 volunteer rescuers from across Britain arrived to help. At least 8 different cave rescue teams took part. Some of the rescuers had worked on the Thai cave rescue in 2018. They formed a human chain inside the cave, passing George on a stretcher through flowing streams, over slippery boulders, and up narrow shafts. The teams worked in shifts around the clock, each group carrying George a little further toward the surface. A special communication system called Cave Link was used to send messages between teams underground and coordinators on the surface. Every inch of progress was hard-won. The cave fought them at every turn with water, cold, and tight spaces. After 54 straight hours, George Linnane's stretcher finally broke through the surface on a foggy Monday night. The crowd of rescuers erupted into cheers and applause. The fog was too thick for a helicopter, so a Land Rover drove him to the nearest hospital. George survived with serious but non-life-threatening injuries. The rescue was the longest stretcher carry in British cave rescue history. Eagle's Nest Christmas Day tragedy. On December 25, 2013, a 35-year-old man named Darren Spivey and his 15-year-old son Dylan drove deep into a wildlife area in west central Florida. It was Christmas morning. They had originally planned to dive a different cave nearby, but the entrance was too difficult to access. So they drove miles into the Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area to a place called Eagle's Nest. Eagle's Nest was one of the deadliest underwater caves in the world. Divers called it the Mount Everest of cave diving. It was deep, dark, and extremely dangerous. Only highly trained and certified cave divers should ever enter it. Darren and Dylan were not certified cave divers. They had no cave diving training at all. But they looked the part. A fellow diver at the site that day said they had double tanks, 7-foot hoses, and canister lights. They looked like they knew what they were doing. A hunter passing through the state park spotted the father and son gearing up at the water's edge. He was the last person to see them alive. Darren and Dylan descended into the cave together on Christmas morning and never came back up. When they did not return, rescue divers were called. The search teams found both bodies deep inside the cave. They had run out of air. Without training, they would not have known the most basic rule of cave diving. The rule of thirds. The rule says you use 1/3 of your air going in, save 1/3 for coming out, and keep 1/3 for emergencies. Darren and Dylan almost certainly went too deep, stayed too long, and burned through their air supply before realizing they could not make it back. In the darkness and the panic, with their tanks running empty, there was nowhere to go. There was no air pocket. There was no surface above them. There was only rock, water, and silence. The deaths shocked the Florida diving community. Some people called for Eagle's Nest to be closed permanently. It had already been shut down once before, from 1999 to 2003, after earlier deaths. Divers had lobbied to reopen it, arguing that with proper training, it could be dived safely. But Darren and Dylan did not have proper training. They had the equipment, but not the knowledge. And the cave does not care what you look like on the surface. It only cares what you know in the dark. A step-grandmother of Dylan asked the state not to close the cave. Instead, she asked authorities to pursue charges against anyone who takes a child cave diving without proper certification. Eagle's Nest remains open today, but every Christmas, divers remember the father and son who went into the darkness together and never came home. Eagle's Nest wrong direction tragedy. On a Saturday in June 2003, 2 friends named John Robinson and Craig Simon entered the Eagle's Nest underwater cave in west-central Florida. John was 36 years old and had been certified to dive caves for over 10 years. Craig was 43 and had been certified for about 2 years. Both men had dived Eagle's Nest before and knew it was dangerous. They had the right equipment, double tanks filled with a special helium air mixture to prevent nitrogen narcosis at depth. They carried propulsion scooters to move quickly through the long tunnels. Everything about this dive looked professional. They descended into the cave and pushed deep into the tunnel system, more than 1,000 feet from the entrance. Then something went wrong. A silt-out hit them. A silt-out happens when a diver's fins or scooter disturb the fine sediment on the cave floor. The particles explode into the water like smoke and turn the visibility to 0 in seconds. One moment you can see the tunnel ahead. The next moment you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. In the blinding cloud of silt, John and Craig lost the guideline, the rope that shows the way out of the cave. John dropped his scooter and searched frantically for the line. He found a line, but in the confusion he did not realize it was leading him the wrong way. Instead of following it toward the exit, he followed it deeper into the cave. Every kick of his fins took him further from safety and burned more of his air. By the time he realized his mistake, if he ever did, it was too late. His air ran out deep inside the cave, and he drowned. Craig's body was found nearby, tangled in a line. It is believed he suffered the same fate. Lost in the silt, unable to find the way out, running out of air in the darkness. It took rescue teams until Monday to recover both bodies. They were found about 1,100 feet inside the cave, at a depth of around 200 feet. The recovery itself was dangerous. Divers had to relay nitrogen bottles to two-point divers to keep them in the water long enough to reach the bodies. After the deaths of John and Craig, the debate about closing Eagle's Nest started again. The cave had been shut down in 1999 after earlier deaths, and had only been reopened in July 2003, just weeks before this tragedy. But Eagle's Nest did not care how many years of experience you had. All it took was one silt out, one moment of confusion, and one wrong turn on a line. John Robinson followed a rope in the dark, trusting it to lead him home. It led him in the opposite direction, and by the time his tank ran dry, home was already too far away. Eagle's Nest buddy-breathing tragedy. On October 15, 2016, 2 experienced cave diving instructors entered one of the most dangerous underwater caves in the world. The cave was called Eagle's Nest. It was hidden in a remote pine forest in west-central Florida, about an hour north of Tampa. From the surface, it looked like an ordinary green pond, but beneath the water it dropped into a maze of dark tunnels and chambers, reaching over 300 feet deep. Divers called it the Mount Everest of cave diving. At least 10 people had already died inside Eagle's Nest since 1981. A sign at the entrance showed an image of the Grim Reaper, warning divers to turn back. But Patrick Peacock and Chris Rittenmeyer were not beginners. Both men were certified cave diving instructors with years of experience. They had dived Eagle's Nest many times before, including the day before this dive. This was supposed to be a weekend of exploration. On Saturday afternoon, the 2 men slipped into the water and descended into the cave. Their friend Justin Blakely stayed in a shallower section while Patrick and Chris went deeper. At 3 p.m., Blakely swam to their meeting point. Patrick and Chris never showed up. He returned every half hour, but there was no sign of his friends. Deep inside the cave, something had gone terribly wrong. Patrick had become stuck in a narrow section about 1,300 feet from the entrance. He made a desperate decision. He removed all of his diving equipment to free himself. He left behind his rebreather, his open-circuit scuba tanks, and his buoyancy equipment. All of it was found later, still working perfectly, lying in the dirt where he dropped it. Now Patrick had no air supply of his own. Chris stayed with him. The 2 men began buddy breathing, sharing one tank of air between them as they swam toward the exit. One breath for Chris, one breath for Patrick, over and over as they kicked through the darkness. They were racing against time and against the air in a single tank. The rescue teams found their bodies 550 feet from the cave entrance. They had made it more than 700 feet back from where Patrick got stuck. They were found near each other. Chris had never left his friend's side. The worst part was what lay just ahead of them. A spare oxygen tank they had placed near the exit was waiting for them, just a short swim away. They almost made it. Chris's father, Ron Rittenmeyer, told reporters his son would never have left his friend behind. That was not how he was trained, and that was not his character. Eagle's Nest had claimed 2 more lives, not beginners, not reckless tourists, but 2 of the best in the world. Mount Gambier cave divers ran out of air. On May 28, 1973, a group of 8 divers arrived at a flooded sinkhole called the Shaft near Mount Gambier in South Australia. The Shaft was famous among divers for its crystal clear water and beautiful underground chambers. From the surface, the entrance was tiny, just 1 meter wide. But below the water, it opened into a massive underwater cave with tunnels stretching deep into the rock. The group had dived at the shaft the day before without any problems. This time, they planned to go deeper. But none of them were trained cave divers. 4 of them claimed to be diving instructors, but none had any cave diving experience. They made a deadly mistake. They entered the cave without a guideline. A guideline is a rope that connects the diver to the exit. Without it, there's no way to find the way out if visibility drops, or the diver becomes confused. The group dropped down into the cave and swam toward a large pile of limestone rubble called the rock pile. Some of the divers stayed near the rock pile, but 4 of them, Stephen Millett, his sister Christine Millett, Gordon Roberts, and John Bockerman, swam further into the darkness. They explored deeper and deeper, losing track of time and burning through their air. When it was time to leave, things went horribly wrong. The surviving divers saw Christine and Gordon try to swim upward toward what they thought was the exit. But instead of following the slope back the way they came, they swam straight up. They ended up inside a dome in the ceiling, a dead end with no way out. The surviving divers could see their torches flickering in the dome above, frantically searching for an exit. Gordon signaled back that they were lost. Christine looked frightened. Then the lights went still. Both Christine and Gordon ran out of air inside that dome and drowned. Their bodies were later found together beneath the ceiling they could not escape. Stephen Millett and John Bockerman also became lost in the cave. Without a guideline, they had no way to find the exit in the dark, silty water. They too ran out of air and drowned. 4 divers dead in 1 day. All because they entered a cave without a simple rope to guide them home. The 4 surviving divers made it out alive, but the damage was done. The Mount Gambier disaster shocked Australia. It led directly to the creation of the Cave Divers Association of Australia later that year. New rules were written. No diver would be allowed into an underwater cave without proper training, a guideline, and enough air to get back. The shaft is still open to trained cave divers today. The memory of those 4 torches going dark in a ceiling dome has never been forgotten. Mossdale Caverns flash flood tragedy. On June 24, 1967, 10 experienced cavers entered one of the most dangerous cave systems in Britain. The cave was called Mossdale Caverns. It sat beneath the lonely moors of the Yorkshire Dales in northern England. The cave stretched for nearly 7 miles underground. Most of the passages were so low that cavers had to crawl on their bellies through freezing water to get through. A return trip to the far end of Mossdale took between 8 and 10 hours. Fewer people had seen the far reaches of this cave than had walked on the moon. The 10 cavers were members of the Happy Wanderers and the Bradford Pothole Club. Experienced underground explorers, June had been a dry month, and the weather that Saturday morning was beautiful. The group entered the cave around lunchtime, full of confidence. 3 hours later, 4 members of the group decided not to continue and turned back toward the entrance. The remaining 6 pushed deeper into the cave. They reached the far end safely and even set off a small explosive charge to try to open a new passage. Nobody knows what happened to them after that. While the 6 cavers were deep inside the mountain, the weather above ground changed without warning. A violent thunderstorm struck the moors. Rain hammered down on the already saturated ground and poured straight into the cave entrance. One of the 4 who had left early, a woman named Morag Forbes, went back to check the cave entrance at 9 p.m. What she found made her blood run cold. The entire entrance was underwater. Mossdale Beck, the stream that normally trickled into the cave, had turned into a raging torrent. The cave was completely flooded. Morag ran 2.5 miles across the dark moorland to the nearest farm and had the farmer call the police. Within hours, every caver in the region had been called to Mossdale. But there was nothing they could do. The water was too high to enter the cave. Rescuers dug a trench to divert the stream away from the entrance and built a dam to hold back the water. By dawn, the scene on the moor looked like a battlefield. Fire engines, tractors, mechanical diggers, and over 300 rescuers. It was the largest cave rescue ever launched in Britain. When the water finally dropped enough to enter, rescue teams crawled into the cave. It took 5 hours to reach the far passages. They found 5 bodies in the far marathon crawls. The 6th body, a young man named John Ogden, was found the next day in a small rift nearby. All 6 had drowned when the rising water filled the low passages they needed to crawl through to escape. The coroner decided the cave was too dangerous to remove the bodies. The entrance was sealed with concrete. 4 years later, friends of the dead cavers entered the cave one last time and buried their bodies in a chamber called the Sanctuary. A memorial cairn sits on the moors above, directly over the place where the bodies were found. Mossdale Caverns remain the deadliest cave incident in British history. The cave proved that a dry summer morning can become a death trap by nightfall if the rain decides to fall. Hidden River Cave. Flash flood escape? On May 26, 2016, a group of college students from Clemson University in South Carolina entered a cave in south-central Kentucky on a geology field trip. The cave was called Hidden River Cave. It was a well-known show cave in the small town of Horse Cave, with guided tours and even an underground museum. The students went in around 10 in the morning with 4 tour guides. They planned to spend about 5 hours exploring the cave as part of their studies. It was a normal, supervised educational trip. But while they were underground, the weather above them turned violent. A flash flood hit the area much earlier than expected. Torrential rain hammered the Kentucky hills and poured straight down into the cave system. The water rose fast. Hidden River Cave had only one entrance, and that entrance was flooding. The students had no idea what was happening above ground. They had no radios and no way to contact the surface. When the guides realized the water was rising, they led the group to a higher section of the cave called the Attic. The attic had a higher ceiling and was safer from the flooding below. The group huddled together in the dark, waiting. On the surface, David Foster, the executive director of the American Cave Museum, saw the flood coming. He grabbed a small team and went into the cave to find the students before the water sealed the entrance. They found the group about a mile inside, safe and dry in the attic. But the way out was filling with water by the minute. 2 local police officers also entered the cave to help, and they too became trapped by the rising flood. Now there were 19 people underground: students, guides, rescuers, and police officers. Over 150 emergency workers gathered at the cave entrance, but nobody could get in. Hours passed with no communication from below. Nobody on the surface knew exactly where the group was or if they were still alive. Inside the cave, the water kept rising. The group made a decision. They could not wait any longer. They would try to walk out through the flood. The 19 people formed a line and waded toward the entrance through pitch-black tunnels filled with rushing water. By the time they reached the entrance passage, the water was up to their necks. They grabbed onto a rope and pulled themselves through the swift current, one by one. At 4:30 in the afternoon, more than 6 hours after they had entered, all 19 people walked out of Hidden River Cave alive. They were soaked, shivering, and exhausted, but not a single person was injured. The students were checked for hypothermia but refused further medical attention. Hidden River Cave proved that even a tourist cave with guided tours can become a death trap when the rain falls fast enough. Veryovkina Cave Flood Pulse Escape. In September 2018, a team of elite Russian cavers and 2 British photographers descended into the deepest known cave on Earth. The cave was called Veryovkina. It plunged 2,212 meters below the surface of the mountains in Abkhazia, a remote territory in the Caucasus region. The expedition leader was Pavel Demidov, one of the best cavers in Russia. The British photographer was Robbie Schoen, hired by National Geographic to take the first ever photos of the cave's deepest point. It took the team 4 days to reach the bottom. Descending thousands of feet of ropes, crawling through mud-choked tunnels, and squeezing through cracks that barely fit a human body. Their deepest camp was a flat, sandy spot nearly 7,000 feet below the surface. They spent 7 days at the bottom exploring, collecting samples, and photographing the terminal lake, a turquoise pool surrounded by jet-black limestone. Then, on the morning of September 16th, everything changed. A radio call crackled through from 2 cavers higher up in the system. A flood pulse was coming. They had 30 minutes. At first, the team was not worried. Flood pulses happen often in deep caves. Then the sound hit them. It was like a freight train crashing through the mountain. The roar got louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Everyone rushed out of the tent and stared up into the darkness above them. Then a massive wall of white and brown water exploded from the shaft above and cascaded past their camp into the abyss below. The ground shook beneath their feet. Robbie Schoen turned to his assistant Jeff Wade and said, "We need to leave right now." There was no time to pack. Robbie abandoned tens of thousands of dollars of photography equipment on the cave floor. He grabbed only 2 memory cards from his camera, the only photos ever taken of the deepest point on Earth, and shoved them into a waterproof bag inside his suit. The team sealed their latex suits, strapped on harnesses, and began climbing for their lives. They crawled along a narrow ledge above rising water, then scaled a 20-meter cliff face with waterfalls hammering down on them from above. When they reached a camp at 1,900 meters deep, they could go no further. Above them, a waterfall had completely flooded the passage to the next level. Below them, the water was still rising. They were trapped between the flood and the falls, nearly 6,000 feet underground. For 16 hours, the team waited. The Russian cavers kept their spirits up, laughing and joking in the tent. Robbie and Jeff could not relax. They kept their harnesses on and paced outside, watching the water level. When the first of the other cavers appeared from the darkness below, Robbie asked if anyone else was behind him. The man said no. In that moment, Robbie and Jeff believed the rest of the team was dead. But one by one, the others appeared. Bruised, soaked, exhausted, but alive. The flood pulse lasted 20 straight hours. Every single member of the expedition survived. Expedition leader Pavel Demidov died 2 years later in a cave near Veryovkina. Robbie Schoen said the experience was so intense that it inspired him to start a family. Veryovkina proved that even the deepest cave on Earth can fill with water in minutes, and that the only way out is up. Alpazat Cave, British Soldiers Flood Rescue. On March 17, 2004, 6 British soldiers and their civilian guide entered a cave system in the mountains of central Mexico. The cave was called Cueva Alpazat. It was over 8 miles long and dropped nearly 300 feet into the earth beneath the Sierra Norte Mountains in the state of Puebla. The soldiers were from the Royal Navy, the British Army, and the Royal Air Force. They were part of an official military caving expedition called the Combined Services Quetzal and Tiger. The trip was planned as a 36-hour training exercise inside the cave. 7 other members of the expedition stayed on the surface as support. 6 underground soldiers pushed deep into the cave, navigating narrow tunnels and flooded sections with expert equipment. Then around noon, the sky above the mountains opened up. Heavy, unforecast rain began hammering the jungle slopes. Several inches of rain fell in a short time. The water poured straight down into the cave system and flooded the low-lying passages near the entrance. Within hours, over 100 meters of tunnel between the soldiers and the exit was completely underwater. There was no way out. The soldiers had trained for this kind of emergency. They retreated deeper into the cave to a pre-prepared emergency camp in a section that had never flooded before. They had sleeping bags, a first aid kit, food, water purification tablets, and a 2-way radio. They radioed the surface team. They were alive, unharmed, and had enough supplies for up to 2 weeks. Morale was high, though they admitted they were slightly bored, but getting them out was not going to be easy. The flooded section was too long and too dangerous for the soldiers to swim through without diving equipment. The British Ministry of Defense took charge of the rescue and flew in 2 of the best cave divers in the world, Rick Stanton and Jason Mallinson from the British Cave Rescue Organization. These were the same 2 divers who would later help save the Thai boys trapped in Tom Luang Cave in 2018. Mexican soldiers and local rescue teams also arrived at the cave entrance to assist, but the rescue caused a diplomatic problem. The British soldiers had not told Mexican authorities they were entering the cave. The Mexican government was furious. Local officials said the lack of advance notice made the rescue much harder than it needed to be. Rumors spread that the British soldiers were secretly surveying the cave for uranium deposits, though the British government denied this. After 8 days underground, Rick Stanton and Jason Mallinson dived through the flooded tunnels and reached the trapped soldiers. They brought diving equipment and guided each soldier one by one through the submerged passage to the exit. All 6 soldiers emerged from the cave on March 25, 2004, healthy and calm after more than a week underground. Blue River Sinkhole fake guide tragedy. In 2003, a group of 6 recreational divers hired a man named Carlos to guide them through a flooded sinkhole cave system in Central America. Carlos advertised himself online as a certified cave diving instructor with 10 years of experience. He posted photos of himself inside underwater caves, wearing professional equipment and flashing a confident smile. His website had dozens of 5-star reviews from satisfied customers. The 6 divers, 4 Americans and 2 Canadians, had booked the trip months in advance. None of them had cave diving certification. They were open water divers looking for an adventure. Carlos told them not to worry. He said he would handle everything. On the morning of the dive, Carlos met the group at the edge of a deep blue sinkhole surrounded by jungle. The water was crystal clear and dropped straight down into a massive underwater chamber. From there, tunnels branched off in every direction into the limestone. Carlos gave the group a short safety briefing and told them to follow him and stay close. He attached a single reel of line to a rock near the surface and began swimming into the cave. The group followed him one by one into the darkness. For the first 10 minutes, everything was beautiful. Sunlight filtered down from the sinkhole above, and the water was warm and still. Then Carlos led them deeper, past the point where daylight could reach. The tunnel narrowed, the ceiling dropped lower. One of the divers kicked the fine silt on the cave floor, and within seconds, a thick brown cloud exploded into the water. Visibility dropped to 0. Nobody could see anything. Not their hands, not their buddy, not the guideline. In the panic, 2 divers lost the line completely. Carlos tried to turn the group around, but in the silt out, he made a critical mistake. He led them down the wrong tunnel. Instead of heading back toward the sinkhole, they swam deeper into the cave system. By the time Carlos realized his error, 2 of the divers were already dangerously low on air. One of them signaled frantically that her tank was nearly empty. Carlos had no spare tanks. He had no emergency breathing equipment. He did not even have a proper cave diving reel, just a cheap spool of line from a hardware store. The 2 low-on-air divers never made it out. Their bodies were found the next day, 200 meters inside the cave, still holding each other's hands. The other 4 divers and Carlos barely escaped, surfacing with almost no air left in their tanks. When investigators examined Carlos's credentials, they discovered the truth. He had never been certified as a cave diving instructor. He had a basic open water instructor card, nothing more. His website reviews were fake. His photos were taken in the cavern zone, not inside real caves. He had been running illegal cave tours for over a year and nobody had checked. Carlos was charged with negligent homicide. 2 families buried their loved ones because one man decided his lies were worth more than their lives. Florida Spring Cave fake certification deaths. A 42-year-old dive instructor named Cliff had a secret. He was certified to teach scuba diving in open water, pools, lakes, and shallow reefs. But he was not certified to dive in caves. Cave diving requires completely different training, different equipment, and different rules. Cliff did not care. He had entered underwater caves many times before without the proper certification, and nothing bad had ever happened. His dive buddy was a 52-year-old man named Andrew. Andrew was an experienced open water diver with several specialty ratings, but he had never been inside an underwater cave in his life. One day, the 2 friends drove to a popular freshwater spring in Florida that had an underwater cave system attached to it. The spring had strict rules. If you did not have cave diving certification, you were not allowed inside the cave. You were not even allowed to bring a dive light with you. When Cliff and Andrew arrived, they watched teams of certified cave divers gear up and enter the system. Then Cliff and Andrew signed forms promising they would only dive in the open water areas. They lied. They had hidden lights in their gear bags. They planned to enter the cave the whole time. Because Cliff was a well-known instructor at the facility, nobody checked their equipment. Nobody questioned them. When they got in the water, Cliff led Andrew toward the open training areas as if they were going for a normal dive. When he was sure nobody was watching, Cliff turned and swam straight into the cave entrance. Andrew followed him into the darkness. They did not tie a safety line at the entrance. They did not follow any of the basic rules that keep cave divers alive. Nobody knows exactly what happened next. Neither man made it out alive to explain. At the end of the day, staff noticed that Cliff and Andrew's gear bags were still sitting on the grass where they had left them. Nobody had seen the 2 men in hours. Staff searched the open water and asked every diver on site if they had seen them. Nobody had. The next day, a recovery team found both bodies 120 feet inside the cave. They were in a small side tunnel off the main system. Andrew's tanks were empty. He had run out of air and drowned. Cliff was wearing double tanks, and when rescuers checked his gear, they found something that made their hearts sink. The valve connecting his 2 tanks was closed. One tank was completely empty, but the other was still full. All Cliff had to do was open the valve or switch to his other regulator. He would have had plenty of air to swim out. But in the panic and the darkness, he never did it. Cliff had taught Andrew to trust him. Andrew had followed his instructor into a place where neither of them belonged. And because Cliff lied about his qualifications, both men died 120 feet from daylight. Vortex Spring Cave Disappearance. In the summer of 2010, a 30-year-old man named Ben McDaniel began diving at a place called Vortex Spring in the Florida Panhandle. Vortex Spring was a popular diving spot with warm, clear water fed by an underground spring. But hidden beneath the surface was a dangerous underwater cave system that stretched for hundreds of meters through solid limestone. 13 divers had already died in that cave during the 1990s. After those deaths, the owners installed a locked metal gate at the cave entrance, 115 feet below the surface. The gate had a sign showing the Grim Reaper, warning divers to turn back. Only divers with full cave diving certification could get the key. Ben did not have cave diving certification. He had never completed the required 2 months of specialized training. He had never done the 125 supervised dives with an instructor that the certification demanded. But Ben told people he was working on getting certified. He told his parents he was researching cave diving and planned to become an instructor. He acted like he knew what he was doing. He had the right equipment. Double tanks, a buoyancy wing, canister lights. He looked professional. The staff at Vortex Spring came to recognize him as a regular. One employee later said that while Ben had the gear and the knowledge, he was often too confident in his own abilities. Ben had been going through a difficult time in his life. He had gone through a divorce. His business had failed. His younger brother had died 2 years earlier, and he was living in his parents' beach house trying to start over. On August 18, 2010, Ben went to Vortex Spring and made a dive during the day. Other divers noticed him looking closely at the area around the cave entrance, as if he was studying it. That evening, 2 employees saw Ben enter the water for another dive. He never came back up. When staff realized Ben was missing, they called in rescue divers. Search teams entered the cave and searched for days. They found some of his equipment, decompression tanks placed at odd spots inside the cave. But they never found his body. Many of the divers who searched the cave said Ben was simply too large to fit through the narrowest passages deeper inside the system. If his body was in there, it was in a place no human could reach. In 2013, the state of Florida declared Ben McDaniel legally dead. His parents still believe his body is somewhere inside the cave, in a section too narrow and too deep for anyone to find. A reward the family offered was pulled after another diver died, possibly trying to collect it. Ben McDaniel never had the certification to enter that cave. But he convinced himself, everyone around him, that he was good enough to go in without it. Vortex Spring kept his body and his secret. Calavera, Cenote unqualified guide deaths. In the summer of 1995, a husband and wife named Harry and Maria ran a dive shop on the island of Cozumel, Mexico. Tourists kept asking them for guided tours of the cenotes, the famous flooded caves on the Yucatan Peninsula. The cenotes were some of the most beautiful underwater caves in the world. Crystal clear water, ancient limestone walls, and tunnels that stretched for kilometers through the jungle. But cenote diving is cave diving. It is one of the most dangerous forms of diving on Earth. Harry and Maria were certified open water divers. They had no cave diving training at all. They needed a guide, someone who could lead tourists safely through the underwater caves. They found a man named Juan. Juan was an open water instructor. He was not a cave diving instructor, and he did not have cave diving certification, but he told Harry and Maria he could handle the job. On August 17, 1995, the group met at a cenote near the town of Tulum. There were 8 divers in total. Harry, Maria, Juan, 3 Dutch tourists, an Italian, and an American woman. None of them were certified cave divers, not one. They strapped on their equipment and dropped into the warm, turquoise water. The cenote was shallow and beautiful, and for the first few minutes, everything felt like paradise. The group trusted Juan completely. He was their dive master, the man in charge of their safety. But Juan led them past the cavern zone and into the real cave system. The passages began to narrow. The ceiling closed in above them. Daylight disappeared behind them. At some point, the group got separated. In the confusion, several divers lost the guideline, the rope that shows the way out. Without it, the tunnels all looked the same. An endless maze of rock and water with no exit in sight. Panic set in. 3 of the 8 divers never made it back to the surface. Harry, Maria, and one other diver drowned inside the cenote. Their bodies were found deep in the cave system, far from the main line. The 5 survivors made it out alive, shaken and traumatized. The investigation revealed the truth. Juan had no business leading anyone into a cave. He was not qualified. He did not have the training, the certification, or the experience to guide tourists through an overhead environment. But he took the job anyway, and because he lied about what he could do, 3 people followed him into the darkness and never came home. Driebelbis Cave Heart Attack Tragedy. On October 1st, 1983, 6 friends entered a limestone cave called Driebelbis Cave near the town of Kutztown in eastern Pennsylvania. It was late at night. They chose to go in after dark because the bats would be out of the cave at that time. One of the group was a 36-year-old man named Robert Scott from the town of Trapp, near Philadelphia. Robert was not an experienced caver. He also suffered from epilepsy. About 75 feet from the entrance, the group reached a narrow vertical crevice in the rock. The crevice was about 80 feet high, but only 12 inches wide at the top. In the middle, it squeezed down to just 7 or 8 inches, barely wider than a human head. The walls were rounded and covered in slippery mud. Robert's friends squeezed through the narrow section on their feet without problems, but Robert decided to crawl through instead. Halfway through the tightest part, his hand slipped on the wet rock. His body dropped down into the narrowest section of the crevice. He was instantly wedged tight, left side down, unable to move in any direction. The walls pressed hard against his chest from both sides. He could barely breathe. His friends tried to pull him free for 8 straight hours, but the rock was too smooth and too slippery. There was nothing to grip. Every time they pulled, Robert's body would not budge. At 9:30 in the morning, the group went for outside help. Volunteers from 4 fire departments arrived first. Then 14 trained cave rescue specialists were flown in from Pittsburgh. Rescuers could reach Robert from above and below the crevice. They could touch him, talk to him, and even feed him. They gave him medicine to control his seizures, and they fed him coffee and hot dogs through the gap in the rock. But they could not pull him out. The rock was too tight and too slippery to get any leverage. Robert began to panic. He screamed and thrashed, which only wedged him deeper into the crevice. Rescuers tried to calm him down, but his fear was overwhelming. Hour after hour, Robert's body temperature dropped in the cold, damp rock. The pressure on his chest made every breath harder than the last. He had been trapped for 29 hours. Then, at about 7 in the morning on Monday, without warning, Robert went silent. His pulse disappeared. His blood pressure dropped to nothing. The rescuers pumped oxygen into the crevice and tried to revive him, but it was too late. Robert Scott had suffered a massive heart attack. The autopsy showed the cause of death was congestive heart failure due to irreversible shock. The shock was caused by cold, fear, and the constant pressure on his chest from the rock. Once Robert was dead, rescuers used painful methods they had avoided while he was alive, dragging his body upward with ropes and slings. It took 5 more hours to pull him out of the crevice. He was removed from the cave at 12:35 in the afternoon. The coroner and rescue coordinator both called for the cave to be permanently sealed. Robert Scott died 75 feet from the entrance, in a spot where rescuers could touch his face but could not save his life. Gouffre de Corbeaux heart attack body recovery. In September 2011, a team of 5 French cavers began a 3-day expedition into a deep cave system in the Pyrenees Mountains on the border between France and Spain. The cave was called Gouffre de Corbeaux, the Pit of the Crows. It dropped over 700 meters below the surface through a series of vertical shafts, narrow tunnels, and underground rivers. Reaching the bottom took a full day of climbing, crawling, and swimming. The expedition leader was a 58-year-old man named Michel. Michel had been caving since he was 17 years old. He had explored some of the deepest caves in Europe. He was fit for his age, lean, strong, and still faster on a rope than most younger cavers. But Michel had a secret he kept from his team. 6 months earlier, his doctor had found an irregular heartbeat during a routine checkup. The doctor told him to avoid extreme physical stress. Michel ignored the warning. He believed his body knew its limits better than any doctor. The team descended through the first day without problems, setting up camp at a depth of 500 meters on a dried ledge above an underground river. That night, Michel complained of feeling tired but blamed it on the long descent. He ate dinner with the group and went to sleep in his bivouac sack. At 3 in the morning, one of the team members woke up to a strange sound. Michel was making short, shallow gasps. His body was shaking. By the time the team member reached him with a headlamp, Michel had stopped breathing. The team tried CPR for over 30 minutes in the freezing cave, taking turns pressing on his chest in a space barely wide enough to kneel. It was no use. Michel was dead. He had suffered a cardiac arrest in his sleep, 500 meters below the surface of the earth. The 4 surviving team members now faced a terrible decision. They could not carry Michel's body out of the cave. The route to the surface involved climbing hundreds of meters of vertical rope, squeezing through passages barely wide enough for a living person, and crossing an underground river. Carrying a dead man through all of that was physically impossible for 4 exhausted cavers. They wrapped Michel's body in his bivouac sack, placed his helmet and headlamp on his chest, and marked the spot with a small cairn of rocks. Then they began the long, silent climb to the surface. It took them 14 hours to reach daylight. A professional body recovery team entered the cave 3 weeks later. It took 40 specialist rescuers 6 days to bring Michael's body to the surface. They had to rig new ropes, install pulleys on every vertical shaft, and build a system of counterweights to haul the stretcher up the narrowest sections. Michael's wife told reporters that she had begged him not to go on the expedition. She said he had smiled and told her he would rather die in a cave than in a hospital bed. He got his wish. Michel's doctor said that at 500 meters deep, with freezing temperatures, thin air, and extreme physical effort, his heart never stood a chance. The cave did not kill Michel, his own pride did. Blue Mountain Pit Cave Heart Attack Rescue. In the summer of 2009, a 61-year-old retired schoolteacher named Frank joined a group of experienced cavers for a trip into a deep pit cave in the mountains of northern Alabama. Frank had been caving for over 30 years. He was one of the most experienced members of his local caving club, but he was also the oldest. The cave they were exploring required a 120-foot rappel down a vertical shaft just to reach the main passage. Frank had done this kind of descent hundreds of times. He clipped into the rope, leaned back over the edge, and dropped smoothly into the darkness below. At the bottom, the cave opened into a network of muddy tunnels and tight crawlways. The group spent 3 hours exploring, mapping a new side passage and photographing unusual formations. Then it was time to leave. Leaving meant climbing back up the 120-foot rope, a brutal physical effort that took most cavers 20 to 30 minutes of nonstop exertion. Frank clipped his ascenders onto the rope and began pulling himself upward. For the first 40 feet, he moved steadily. Then he started to slow down. His breathing became ragged and loud, echoing off the walls of the shaft. At about 60 feet and halfway up, Frank stopped moving. He hung on the rope in the middle of the shaft, gasping for air. His chest felt like it was being crushed from the inside. His left arm tingled and went weak. He tried to call down to his friends, but his voice came out as a whisper. The caver waiting at the bottom of the rope saw Frank's headlamp stop moving and shouted up to him. Frank did not respond. He was having a heart attack, suspended on a rope 60 feet above the cave floor and 60 feet below the surface. The group radioed for help from the cave entrance. A rescue team arrived within 2 hours. But getting to Frank was the problem. He was hanging in the middle of a vertical shaft with no ledge, no platform, and no way to lay him down. A rescuer rappelled down from above and reached Frank on the rope. Frank was conscious but barely moving. His skin was gray and cold, and his pulse was weak and irregular. The rescuer attached a second rope to Frank's harness and, with help from the team above, slowly hauled him up the remaining 60 feet to the top of the shaft. It took over an hour to raise him those 60 feet. At the surface, paramedics were waiting with a stretcher and oxygen. Frank was airlifted to a hospital 40 miles away. Doctors said he had suffered a major heart attack and was lucky to be alive. If the attack had happened 10 minutes later, when he was higher on the rope and further from help, he almost certainly would have died hanging in the darkness. Frank never went caving again. He told his friends that the cave had given him 30 good years and then sent him one final message. It was time to stop. Cumberland Caverns heart attack collapse. In January 2004, a group of teenagers from a church youth program arrived at a large show cave in central Tennessee for a weekend adventure. The cave was famous for its enormous underground chambers and stunning rock formations. The group had 22 teenagers and 3 adult leaders. The oldest leader was a 54-year-old man named David. David had organized the trip. He had visited the cave once before years ago and told the kids it would be the highlight of their year. The group signed up for a guided walking tour that went deep into the cave system. The path was well lit and paved in most sections, but in some areas the tour required climbing over boulders, ducking under low ceilings, and squeezing through narrow gaps. David was a big man. He was overweight and had high blood pressure. but he had not told anyone in the group about his health problems. He did not want the kids to worry. For the first hour, everything was fine. The teenagers laughed and took photos of the huge stalactites hanging from the ceiling. David walked at the back of the group, moving slower than the others but keeping up. Then the tour reached a long, uphill section deep inside the cave. The air was cool and damp, and the climb was steeper than it looked. David started breathing heavily. His face turned red. Sweat poured down his forehead even though the cave temperature was only 12 degrees Celsius. One of the teenagers noticed and asked if he was okay. David waved them off and said he just needed a minute. He sat down on a rock ledge and tried to catch his breath. Then his left arm went numb. A crushing pain spread across his chest like a heavy weight pressing down on his ribs. David grabbed his chest and fell sideways off the ledge. The guide radioed the surface immediately. Two of the adult leaders began CPR while the teenagers stood in the dark, crying and holding each other. A medical team from the surface rushed into the cave with a defibrillator and emergency supplies. They reached David in about 40 minutes. They shocked his heart 3 times. But David never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead deep inside the cave, surrounded by the children he had brought there to have the time of their lives. The teenagers had to walk past David's body on their way out of the cave. Some of them never went underground again. David's wife later said he had been warned by his doctor not to do anything physically demanding. But he loved those kids and did not want to let them down. His heart gave out trying to keep up with them in the dark. Riviere Souterraine, cave, solo, explorer lost. In March 2015, a 34-year-old amateur caver named Thomas entered a large cave system in the mountains of southern France alone. He had visited the cave twice before with friends and believed he knew the main passages well enough to explore solo. Thomas brought a helmet with a mounted headlamp, a handheld backup torch, and a small pack with water and a sandwich. He told his girlfriend he would be back by dinner. The cave was over 3 kilometers long with hundreds of side passages, narrow crawlways, and junctions where 3 or 4 tunnels branched off in different directions. For the first 2 hours, Thomas moved confidently through the familiar sections. Then he decided to explore a side passage he had never been in before. Passage twisted and turned, dipped low, then rose again into a series of small chambers connected by narrow gaps. Thomas squeezed through gap after gap, excited by the feeling of discovering something new. He did not mark his route. He did not leave any trail markers. He did not count the turns. When he decided to turn back, he realized he could not remember which gap he had come through. The chambers all looked the same. Gray limestone walls, muddy floors, and darkness. He picked a direction and crawled. After an hour, he emerged into a passage he did not recognize. He tried another direction. Same result. Unfamiliar rock, unfamiliar shapes, unfamiliar darkness. Thomas was lost. He sat down and turned off his headlamp to save battery. The darkness was absolute. He could not see his hand touching his face. He turned the lamp back on and tried again. For the next 6 hours, Thomas walked, crawled, climbed, and squeezed through every passage he could find. He ended up in the same chamber 3 times. He was walking in circles and he knew it. His headlamp began to flicker. The battery was dying. He switched to his backup torch. It lasted 2 more hours before it went dark too. Now Thomas was in total darkness with no light at all. He sat on the cave floor with his back against the wall and tried to stay calm. He ate his sandwich slowly. He sipped his water. He talked to himself to keep from panicking. When his girlfriend called the police that evening, a search team was dispatched to the cave. The local cave rescue group entered the system with maps and powerful lights. They found Thomas 19 hours after he entered the cave, sitting in the dark about 800 meters from the entrance. He was shivering, dehydrated, and disoriented, but alive. When the rescuers shone their headlamps on him, Thomas started crying. He said the worst part was not the cold or the hunger. It was knowing he was walking in circles but having no way to stop. Every direction felt right and every direction was wrong. Thomas never went caving alone again. He said the cave had taught him something he would never forget. In the dark, your brain lies to you and the walls never tell the truth. Mammoth Ridge Cave, lost group light failure. In the fall of 2007, a group of 5 college students from a university in Kentucky decided to explore a wild cave in the hills outside their campus town. The cave was on private land, and the farmer who owned the property told them they were welcome to go in as long as they were careful. He said the cave went back about a mile and had lots of side passages. He warned them not to go too deep. The students brought cheap flashlights from a convenience store. 2 of them had headlamps. None of them had backup lights. None of them had helmets. None of them told anyone exactly where they were going or when they planned to come back. They entered the cave around noon on a Saturday. For the first hour, everything was fun. The main passage was tall enough to walk through, and the students laughed and shouted, listening to their voices echo off the limestone walls. Then the passage split into 3 directions. They chose the middle one. It narrowed into a low crawlway that forced them onto their hands and knees. After 20 minutes of crawling, the passage opened into a large room with several more tunnels branching off in different directions. By now, they had lost track of which tunnel they had come from. They picked a direction and kept going. Then the first flashlight died. The batteries were cheap and had been sitting on a store shelf for months. Within the next hour, 2 more flashlights failed. Now the group had only 2 headlamps between 5 people. They turned around and tried to find the way out. But every passage looked the same. Gray rock, muddy floor, and darkness in every direction. They walked for 2 hours and ended up back in the same large room they had started from. They had walked in a complete circle without realizing it. Panic set in. One of the students began crying. Another started hyperventilating. The group leader told everyone to sit down, turn off the headlamps to save battery, and think. They sat in total darkness for 30 minutes. Nobody spoke. In the silence, one of them heard something, a faint sound of dripping water coming from one of the passages. They remembered that the entrance had a small stream running along the floor. They decided to follow the sound of water. It took them 4 more hours of crawling, backtracking, and following the stream before they finally saw a faint gray glow ahead. It was daylight. They stumbled out of the cave entrance at 2 in the morning, 14 hours after they went in. They were covered in mud, soaked to the skin, and shaking from cold and fear. The farmer found them sitting in his field at dawn, too exhausted to walk back to their car. He shook his head and said, "I told you not to go too deep. Every caving manual in the world says the same thing. Bring 3 sources of light per person." 5 students brought 5 cheap flashlights between them. The cave nearly kept all of them. Paris catacombs lost forever. In November 1793, a 61-year-old man named Philibert Asperc walked down a staircase and never came back up. Philibert was a doorkeeper at the Val-de-Grâce military hospital in Paris during the French Revolution. Beneath the hospital courtyard, there was a staircase that led down into the Paris catacombs. The catacombs were a massive network of old limestone quarry tunnels stretching over 300 kilometers beneath the city. Nobody knows why Philibert went down those stairs. Some say he wanted to explore the tunnels out of curiosity. Others say he was trying to reach the cellars of a nearby monastery to steal their famous liquor. Whatever his reason, Philibert went into the darkness, carrying only a single candle. 1 candle. That was all the light he had between himself and 300 kilometers of pitch-black tunnels. At some point, the candle went out. Maybe it burned down to nothing. Maybe a gust of damp underground air blew it out. Either way, when that flame died, so did any chance Philibert had of finding his way home. The catacombs beneath Paris are not a simple tunnel with a start and an end. They are a maze. Hundreds of passages that split, connect, loop back, and dead end in every direction. Every wall looks the same. Every turn feels the same. In total darkness, without any point of reference, a person will walk in circles without ever knowing it. Philibert wandered. Nobody knows for how long. A healthy person can survive about 3 days without water. In the cold, damp air of the catacombs, about 14 degrees Celsius year-round, he might have lasted longer. But eventually his strength gave out. He collapsed somewhere in the tunnels, alone, in complete darkness, surrounded by the bones of 6 million dead Parisians. And then the world forgot about him. The French Revolution was raging above ground. People disappeared every day during the Reign of Terror. One missing doorkeeper was nothing unusual. 11 years passed. In 1804, workers mapping the tunnels found a skeleton lying on the floor of a remote gallery. The bones were dressed in rotting clothes. A hospital keyring still hung from the belt. That keyring was how they identified him. Philibert Asperc, the doorkeeper who had walked into the dark in 1793 and never walked out. They buried him right where they found him. His gravestone was placed in the tunnel floor. His grave is still there today, deep in the restricted section of the catacombs beneath the streets of modern Paris. People who explore the illegal parts of the tunnels sometimes visit his tomb. They call him the patron saint of the catacombs. But Philibert Asperc was not a saint. He was a man with 1 candle who walked into 300 kilometers of darkness and never found the light again. Paris catacombs. Teenagers lost 3 days. In June 2018, two teenage boys in Paris decided to sneak into the catacombs. They were 16 and 17 years old. The Paris catacombs are a massive underground network of tunnels, stretching over 300 kilometers beneath the city. Only a tiny section is open to tourists. The rest is illegal to enter. Signs warn people to stay out. Police patrol the entrances. But every year, hundreds of thrill seekers find a way in through hidden manholes, broken walls, and unmarked entrances scattered across the city. The two boys slipped underground through one of these secret entrances. At first, it was exciting. The tunnels were cool and quiet, lined with stacked human bones from centuries of Paris burials. Skulls stared at them from the walls. The boys took photos and explored deeper. Then they made a wrong turn. In the catacombs, one wrong turn is all it takes. The tunnels all look the same. Low stone ceilings, narrow passages, and endless forks that lead to more forks. There are no signs underground. There are no landmarks. Without a map or a guide, every direction looks identical. The boys tried to retrace their steps, but every passage they chose led them somewhere they did not recognize. They were walking in circles. Their phone batteries died. Their lights grew weaker. The temperature underground was a constant 14 degrees Celsius, cool enough to slowly drain the heat from their bodies hour after hour. One day passed, then two. They had no food and no clean water. They huddled together in the cold darkness, shivering, waiting for someone to find them. On the surface, their friends raised the alarm when the boys did not come home. Police were called and specialist catacomb patrol teams were sent underground. But searching 300 kilometers of tunnels for two teenagers is like searching an entire city block by block. The search teams brought dogs. Rescue dogs trained to track human scent through tunnels and underground spaces. In the early hours of the third day, the dogs picked up a trail. The rescue team followed the scent through passage after passage until they found the two boys sitting in the dark, shaking with cold. Both teenagers were suffering from hypothermia. They were rushed to hospital and treated. Both survived. They had been lost underground for 3 full days. 72 hours of darkness, cold, hunger, and the knowledge that the tunnels around them held the bones of 6 million people who would never leave either. The boys never went back. Devil's Hole ignored. Warning drowning. In 1965, a 20-year-old named Paul Giancontieri and a 19-year-old named David Rose drove out to the middle of the Nevada desert near Death Valley. They were looking for a place called Devil's Hole. Devil's Hole was a small opening in the desert rock, barely 10 feet wide. From the surface, it looked like nothing, just a puddle of still water in the middle of nowhere. But below that water was something terrifying. Devil's Hole was the entrance to an underwater cave system so deep that nobody had ever reached the bottom. Divers had lowered measuring lines over 1,200 feet down and still never hit the floor. The water inside was ancient. Over 10,000 years old, left behind by glaciers from the last ice age. It was warm, dark, and filled with powerful currents that pulled everything downward. The area around Devil's Hole was surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Warning signs were posted everywhere. The signs made it clear entry was forbidden, the water was deadly, and swimming was absolutely prohibited. Paul and David ignored every single warning. They climbed over the fence, they walked past the signs. They brought no scuba equipment. They had only snorkel masks and swim fins, gear designed for shallow pools and calm beaches, not for a bottomless underwater cave. The two friends lowered themselves into the warm water and began to dive. A third friend named Bill Alter went in with them. For the first few feet, it felt easy. The water was warm and clear, but Devil's Hole drops fast. Within seconds, the depth goes from inches to hundreds of feet. Paul was the first to go under and not come back up. He disappeared below the surface without a sound. David dove down after his friend to try to find him. He never resurfaced either. Bill tried to follow but became disoriented in the dark water. He barely made it back to the surface alive. He would be the last person to leave Devil's Hole that day. Rescue divers searched the cave for days. They found nothing. The bodies of Paul Giancontieri and David Rose were never recovered. Divers discovered that beneath the visible bottom of the cave, a small opening led to a far larger and still unexplored section. A powerful current flowed through that opening, pulling everything deeper like a drain. The two boys were almost certainly dragged down into that abyss. After the deaths, the government added more fencing and stronger locks around Devil's Hole. But people kept coming. In 2016, 3 men climbed the fence in the middle of the night, fired shotguns at the locks, and went swimming drunk in the cave. One of them vomited in the water and left his underwear floating on the surface. A rare pupfish, one of fewer than 115 left on Earth, was found dead the next day. Devil's Hole does not care about fences, signs, or warnings. It sits in the desert and waits. And when people ignore the signs, it keeps them forever. Maldives cave diving ignored depth limit. On May 15, 2026, 5 Italian divers slipped beneath the turquoise water of Vavu Atoll in the Maldives and never came back up. The group included Monica Montefalcone, a 51-year-old marine biology professor and television personality from the University of Genoa. With her was her 22-year-old daughter, Giorgia Somakal. 2 young researchers, 31-year-old Federico Gualtieri and 31-year-old Muriel Odanino, joined them. Their diving guide was 44-year-old Gianluca Benedetti, an Italian instructor based in the Maldives. The group had permission from Maldivian authorities to conduct research dives on soft corals near the atoll, but the authorities did not know the divers were planning to enter an underwater cave. The Maldives has a strict 30-meter depth limit for tourist diving. The cave entrance sat at 47 meters, already well past the legal limit. The cave itself plunged to over 60 meters deep. If the Maldives government had known the divers were going into a cave at that depth, they would have sent the Coast Guard to assist. Nobody was sent. Nobody was told. The 5 divers descended to the cave entrance and swam inside. The first chamber was large and bright, with a sandy bottom and enough sunlight to see clearly. From there, a narrow 30-meter-long corridor led to a second chamber deeper inside the rock. The corridor ended in a sandbank that was easy to swim over on the way in. But on the way out, the sandbank created an optical illusion. It hid the correct exit corridor from view. When the divers tried to leave, they could not find the way out. In the confusion, they swam into a tunnel to the left of the real exit. That tunnel was a dead end. There was no way out. Their air was limited. They only had enough for a few minutes at that depth. There was no time for multiple attempts. All 5 divers died inside the dead-end corridor. Gianluca, the guide, was found near the entrance to the first chamber. He may have tried to go for help. The other 4 were found together in the dead-end tunnel. The Maldivian military sent divers to recover the bodies. One of those military divers, a man named Mohammed Mahoudi, died from decompression sickness during the recovery operation. 6 people were now dead because of a single dive. Finnish recovery specialists from Divers Alert Network Europe were flown in to finish the job. They recovered the remaining 4 bodies and discovered GoPro cameras that may help explain what happened in the final minutes. Investigators are now asking hard questions. Why were the divers allowed to exceed the 30-meter limit? Why did they enter a cave without telling authorities? Why was there no safety plan for a cave dive at 60 meters? The Maldives called it the worst diving accident in the country's history. The cave in Vavu Atoll was not hidden. The depth limit was not a secret. The rules were clear. 5 people ignored them and 6 people died. Sea cave tide warning ignored tragedy. In August 2017, a couple from London named Sarah and Marcus were on holiday on the coast of Portugal. They were walking along a beach in the Algarve when they spotted a large sea cave at the base of the Golden Cliffs. The cave was wide and tall, big enough to walk into without ducking. Inside, the cave stretched back about 50 meters with towering walls carved by centuries of crashing waves. At the entrance, a sign was bolted to the rock in 4 languages: Portuguese, English, Spanish, and French. It said, "Warning, this cave floods at high tide. Do not enter within 2 hours of high tide. People have drowned here." Marcus checked his phone. High tide was in 90 minutes. Sarah said they should wait and come back the next day. Marcus said 90 minutes was plenty of time. They would only be inside for 20 minutes. They walked in. The cave was magnificent. The walls glowed orange and gold in the afternoon light. Water dripped from the ceiling and shallow pools reflected the rock above like mirrors. They took photos, explored side chambers, and climbed over boulders to reach the back of the cave. At the very back, they found a narrow passage that led to a small hidden beach, surrounded on all sides by rock. It was like a secret room inside the cliff. They sat down to take photos and eat snacks from their bags. They lost track of time. When they finally stood up to leave, the water had already started to rise. The passage they had walked through on dry sand was now ankle-deep in seawater. They waded through, not worried yet. But the main chamber of the cave had changed completely. Water was pouring in from the mouth of the cave in powerful surges. Each wave pushed deeper into the chamber, and each wave was bigger than the last. Within minutes, the water was waist-deep and rising fast. Marcus grabbed Sarah's hand and they tried to wade toward the entrance, but the current was too strong. Each surge knocked them off their feet. The water kept rising into their chests, then their shoulders, then their necks. Sarah screamed for help, but the cave swallowed the sound. Marcus pushed Sarah onto a narrow rock ledge near the ceiling and climbed up beside her. The ledge was barely wide enough to sit on. Below them, the water continued to rise. For 2 hours, they clung to that ledge as the tide filled the cave around them. The water came within inches of their faces before it finally stopped rising. At high tide, a local fisherman heard screaming from inside the cliff. He called the Coast Guard. Rescuers in a small inflatable boat entered the cave through the flooded entrance and found Sarah and Marcus on the ledge, shaking, soaked, and barely conscious. They were pulled out and taken to hospital for hypothermia. Both survived. The Coast Guard officer who rescued them said he had pulled people from that cave 3 times in the past year alone. Every time, it was the same story. They read the sign, checked the tide, and went in anyway. The sign said 90 minutes was not enough. Marcus thought he knew better. The ocean proved him wrong. Cenote warning sign ignored drowning. In the summer of 2019, a group of 4 American college students on spring break in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula found a cenote deep in the jungle. A cenote is a natural sinkhole where the limestone ground has collapsed and exposed the underground river below. The Yucatan is full of them. Thousands of blue pools hidden among the trees, some with underwater cave systems stretching for miles. This cenote was not on any tourist map. A local taxi driver had told them about it. He said the water was beautiful but warned them, "Do not go past the light zone." A rusted metal sign stood at the edge of the cenote. It showed a picture of the Grim Reaper and a skull and crossbones. The words on the sign were in Spanish and English. Danger, underwater cave. Do not enter without cave diving certification. People have died here. The 4 students looked at the sign, laughed, and jumped in. The cenote was stunning. Warm, crystal-clear water that dropped straight down into a wide blue chamber. Sunlight poured in from above, turning everything a brilliant turquoise. 2 of the students, Tyler and Jake, had brought cheap snorkel masks and fins. They were strong swimmers and confident in the water. They swam to the far side of the cenote and found a dark opening in the rock wall where the light faded into blackness. That was the entrance to the cave. Tyler swam a few meters inside and came back, saying it was incredible, like swimming into another world. Jake followed him in. They swam further this time. Without fins designed for cave diving, their kicks stirred up the fine sediment on the cave floor. Within seconds, a cloud of silt exploded through the water. The crystal-clear visibility dropped to 0. Tyler could not see his own hands. He turned around, or what he thought was around, and swam. He hit a wall. He turned again and swam into another wall. Every direction felt wrong. His chest tightened. He was running out of breath. Tyler managed to claw his way along the ceiling until he felt open water above him and kicked upward into the light. He broke the surface, gasping and coughing. Jake did not come up. Tyler screamed his friend's name across the cenote. The 2 students on the bank called emergency services. A local cave diving team arrived within 2 hours. They found Jake's body 40 meters inside the cave, in a narrow passage with no exit. He had swum the wrong direction in the silt out and run out of air in a dead end. He was 21 years old. The Grim Reaper sign still stands at the edge of that cenote today. The same sign Jake and Tyler laughed at before they jumped in.